I think that, well, to start off with, it wasn't until the early 80s that the BBC reminded all of us that these recordings still existed. Since that time, we have worked together with the BBC. We have also worked together with Apple to find the appropriate moment to release them. The culmination of all of that is here we are today, and we believe that this is the most appropriate time to be releasing these recordings into the marketplace. I should also add that a lot of time and effort has gone into preparing this package here. And it does take a lot of time. I mean, George Martin has spent a lot of hours going through all of these tapes trying to make the selections. And so it does take a while to put the stuff together, but here we are.
I'm slow.
November 1994, we feel, is a good time to be releasing this package.
Thank you. Gentleman in the front row, could you stand up, please, and just tell us who you are?
This is Thomas speaking, Brian's World Magazine, Vienna, Austria. This is a question to Brian and Alan. When you're working with these boys back in the 60s, did you realize that this is the big one, that you will still be talking about this 30 years on?
Can I come quickly on that, because the immediate answer is no. The first reaction was they were extra special, and as I mentioned in the video which you've seen, they were far streets ahead of most of their contemporaries, and some would like to argue with me about that because they're still around and performing today. 3 or 4, no, half a dozen groups, and performing brilliantly. But they weren't in the same category as the Beatles in any way. They weren't musically as advanced, they weren't as creative in the way of writing their own material, and they weren't as exciting in performance. They weren't as witty in presentation of their material, which was a great plus for the Beatles. But having said all that, one was living in an era when groups were performing left, right, and centre. Artists were coming in from everywhere and getting great hit records, becoming world smashes and so on. And I think it would have been a fool rather than a wise man who said the Beatles in 30 years' time will be as famous as they are, or more famous than they are today. That's the way it's turned out. I certainly wouldn't have predicted it, and I can't remember anyone who did. Did you, Alex?
No, I didn't. I didn't predict it, but as I said before, there was something terribly fresh and terribly spontaneous about them. And you knew that, you had the feeling that something was about to break, because in 1958 and 59 and 60, etc., we had the Two Eyes Coffee Bar in Soho, we had people like Tommy Steele, Marty Wilde, etc., all starting to do their own thing, not to depend on American records and American lyrics, but in fact to do their very own thing, to start their own songwriting mountain that was about to build here in this country. And I think that also in talking to them individually and finding that they really were very deep-thinking lads, and then coming and putting this music together so quickly and it getting your attention, I think one had the feeling that something was going to happen. But like Brian Matthew, would I have said that they were going to be world major stars? No. And what I think is very significant, ladies and gentlemen, is that 30 years later, here we all are, assembled here at the BBC with a brand new CD of their sessions from 1963-64, and all of us, including yourselves, showing that interest all over again. And I find that very exciting indeed.
Thank you. Gentleman in the red sweater there.
Piotr Schmerz-Arme.
Well, we did, and so as soon as I'd finished what I thought was right, I pumped it over to them and said, look, Paul, what do you think of it? Great, marvellous, let's go ahead with it. That's all it amounted to.
The other thing I would say is that also this piece of artwork has been selected by them, by Apple. And so in that respect, the whole packaging, the contents of the packaging, they have been involved in. And obviously, it has to meet their approval and their standards as well before it can be released.
So all 4 of them, and I'm including Yoko in that, Paul, George and Ringo, and Yoko have approved what is going out.
Thank you. Gentleman at the front here.
Frank de Meyer, Belgian Radio.
The Beatles played, apart from their own songs, a lot of covers. Chuck Berry, Carl Perkins. Does anyone have any idea who made the choice? Was it Ringo who chose one song, George who chose two songs, and then all the rest chosen by Paul and John, or whatever?
Having recently had, 2 weeks ago, the good fortune to record a lengthy interview with Carl Perkins, I can only tell you what he told me in answer to that question. And that was that John Lennon was extremely knowledgeable about, although Ringo became the one to record the songs that we know of, John, on meeting Carl Perkins for the first time, said, "Hey, great, here's the man who wrote the right string, wrong yo-yo," and so on. And he knew all of Carl's early material, and I should think had quite a persuasive say in how much of it was performed.
Can I add as well that they tend to cast themselves in the roles of different people, so that Paul McCartney would usually do Little Richard, John Lennon would usually do Chuck Berry. They had their own particular favourites. Carl Perkins, they did actually tend to carve up between themselves, as with Elvis. They all used to have a crack at Elvis numbers, apart from Ringo, I think. But they had their heroes. And these songs, the unreleased songs on this album, really give you a fantastic insight into their heroes. And I think you have to remember that in the EPK, it was pointing out that pop music was very severely rationed in Britain. You couldn't hear Chuck Berry on the airwaves very much at all. So anybody interested in rock and roll, it was like a secret society. You had to find this stuff. And you might hear it for a quarter of an hour on Radio Luxembourg at a particular time, and the signal would be phasing in and out. Or you might, Paul McCartney has pointed out in interviews, you might hear of somebody on the other side of town who's got a copy of the Coasters doing Yakety Yak. Let's go find him, let's learn the chords, let's learn the words. So it was very, very much an underground thing at that time. We all know about rock and roll now, but it was very, very hard to find out about this stuff. And the Beatles used to compete with the other Mersey groups to get the most unusual material. You'll find on this disc that they cover a lot of B-sides. So rather than just go for the obvious A side of a record, they'd trump rival groups by learning the B side, just to have one over the others. So that this material is fascinating from that point of view, from song selection.
Thank you, Kevin. Gentleman in the third row.
Yes, David Stark from Songlink International, and my question sort of neatly follows on from that. Obviously, the majority of the album is cover versions, and going to make the songwriters and their publishers extremely happy to have an official cover by the Beatles all these years later. Just wondering if there has been any pre-reaction or any response from the writers themselves, those that are still living, about having songs on the album.
Can anyone answer that?
Not that, certainly not that we're aware of.
I could say to you that in the Hard Rock Cafe in New York, where this is beaming to and they're carrying on later, they do have Chuck Berry and Carl Perkins, and they will be answering questions later in New York. So I could answer that question by saying at least those two have taken a great interest in it. There's a lady in the centre aisle here.
I'm Caroline Sullivan from The Guardian. Rupert Perry, why did you decide that now was the appropriate time to release this?
I wouldn't say that it was absolutely EMI'S decision, all right? We worked in conjunction with Apple, which is the Beatles company, in trying to work out what was the best moment in time, and hence it's a mutual decision between EMI and Apple to release at this time. Why? That's kind of the way it's turned out. There's no underlying reason to that. I think that you will recall just over a year ago, another mutual decision was taken by Apple and EMI to release what are called the Red and the Blue albums on compact disc. At the time, we were obviously aware of this material. We weren't certain as to whether it was feasible to actually put it together and put on compact disc, and that is what has taken place in the last 18 months. And so we've kind of got to that stage, and we realized that it is material that is good enough to be released, and that is very much the opinion of the individual Beatles as well as Apple, and hence the reason we're here at this point. But there's nothing special about this year or last year or anything like that.
Okay, thank you. There's a gentleman right at the back whom I think I recognize.
Yes, Jonathan King, superstar here. Questions to Rupert Perry and to Kevin Howlett, actually. It's the same question, but it's two different people. This is a brilliant compilation. I think he's going to do incredibly well because it's got some fantastic stuff on it. I shall certainly be going to purchase my copy immediately. But it strikes me that three separate parties were involved in the Beatles. The Beatles, who provided the musical talent and the songs and the performances in the early days. EMI Records, who looked after them and promoted them and pushed them and did a great job doing so. And the BBC, who specifically in this compilation, but also generally, promoted them as a brand new band. Is it the intention of EMI Records to keep signing new young bands and push them as hard as they pushed the Beatles? And more important, Kevin, is it still the purpose of the BBC to continue playing new young music that in 30 years' time will be as important to kids in 30 years' time and to those adults of us who survived for 30 years as the Beatles is today?
Three. Thank you, Jonathan. I knew we could rely on it. Take the microphone away from him quickly. Right. Okay. And who's going to go first?
First of all, Mr. King, you are indeed a superstar. We're very honored today with your presence. Thank you for coming. Of course, it is the intention of EMI to continue to sign and to push new bands. And I know that if you personally don't feel we're doing a good enough job, you will call me and remind me of that.
Right, that's the EMI bit out of the way. Kevin, what have you got to say?
The answer was yes.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, Radio 1 is committed to recording live music, and we have programs like the evening session, Finding New Bands. John Peel still continues to do his wonderful work. Andy Kershaw, lots of other people, as you well know. And yes, is the answer.
Good.
Can I say something about that?
Please, George.
Because, you know, 1962 was when the Beatles came to EMI, and I signed them originally. And I signed them not because they were good songwriters, but because they had great charisma and they had great... I knew they were the kind of people that would put themselves over as characters to the public. Later on, they showed that they were great songwriters. I think it was the latter fact that made them such great stars. If they'd been just performers, I don't think we would still be talking about them 30 years later. And along with this, you've got to remember that the song is where the music starts. And songwriters have to be encouraged as well as performers. And I'd like the A&R people and record companies and BBC to recognize that fact. That's what we're looking for as well. We're looking for great songwriters as well as great performers.
If I can just add again to that, the Beatles auditioned for the BBC in very early in 1962 and passed their audition and made several broadcasts before George even recorded them and released their first single. So the BBC was well ahead of the case in 1962, and I think it still continues to be well ahead of the case in many, on many bands.
Still got those on tape?
Unfortunately, the 1962 recordings don't exist. They were done in Manchester, and they were live shows.
Well, these were Pete Best.
Pete Best was in the first few programs, yes, with the Beatles, yeah. And in fact, it's interesting also that the Beatles wore suits for the first time when they went to the BBC to do their first broadcast. That was the moment that Brian Epstein got them out of their leathers and put them in suits, because you're going to the BBC, so you better put a suit on. And that was the start of the well-groomed Beatles.
Thank you. Gentleman right at the front here now.
Johan Ralph for Studio Brussels, Belgian Radio. A question for George Martin. What is your favorite song of the selection?
Oh, gosh.
And why?
It's impossible to say, because there are so many...
You can pick three.
So many songs in it that I had already recorded. There are, I think the ones I like are the ones are the unusual ones. Carabella, for example, I think is a great rock track that we never recorded at Abbey Road. But there are quite a few. It would be impossible for me to say which one I like better than any other. I like the whole album. I can tell you that. I do play it. I have been playing it.
Thank you. There's a lady at the back.
Lourdes Gomez from El País, Spain. Mr. Martin, I mean, with the following, you didn't record, I think you say about 30 of these songs for previously in record. I mean, when you were looking back, I mean, do you regret not having done at least some of those songs? And why do you think it's valuable to have them now in record as it wasn't before?
I think you were talking about, would you have liked the Beatles to have recorded some of these songs for EMI? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yes.
The ones that we did.